welcome back. This is Matt Chat episode 191, featuring an interview with Mr. Neal Hallford, a writer and the game designer. He's probably best known for his work on Betrayal at Krondor and Dungeon Siege, but he also worked on Planet's Edge and much, much more. In this first slice of the interview, we talk about his early days, how he got his start in the computer games industry. I think you'll find that quite interesting, especially the part where he talks about what it was like working with John Van Kenningham, JVC, at New World Computing. A lot of great stuff in this interview, so without further ado, here is Mr. Neal Hallford. All right, folks, I am here with Neal Hallford. He is a game designer, book author, screenwriter, and film director. He's probably best known for his work on Betrayal at Krondor, Dungeon Siege, and Champions of Norath. He's also got a book called Swords and Circuitry, A Designer's Guide to Computer Role-Playing Games, so we can talk about that too. Got his hand in a lot of pies, and hopefully will soon be part of the Wildman project, if that gets off the ground, which we're all hoping it will. How are you doing today, Neal?
I'm doing good. I'm doing very, very well. You know, it's kind of crazy day here in Southern California. It's raining, and so nobody here knows what to do whenever water falls out of the sky. We try to let people know that it happens regularly in other parts of the country. Do not panic. But it's a good day. It's a good day.
All right, I thought we'd get started just by talking about your background and as a gamer and your educational background. I understand you played a lot of coin-operated arcade machines. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that era.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, my first computer game that I can recall pretty vividly was I used to go to a little kind of community center sometimes, and they had a stand-up arcade machine for Space War, and so. For those of you who remember, Space War was a little bit like Asteroids, but it had a lot more controls to what you could do because you could change the gravity and you could set up you were able to decide which corners you're going to loop through. And so it was kind of cool because as opposed to any other title that was, I mean, you had Asteroids, but you didn't really have control of what's going on. And the fun part is it actually allowed you as a player to decide what the environment was going to be to a very small, limited degree. It was still within the parameters that whatever the designer set up for you. Just completely riveted to it. Of course, another thing about Space War is that the icon for your ship was the Enterprise. And of course, it wasn't really the Enterprise. We all know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Oh, no, that's not the Enterprise. It just sort of looks like it. And the ships that you're attacking only sort of kind of look like Tholian ships, but we'll ignore all of that. But anyway, I love Space War. And God, I can't even begin to count the number of quarters that I blew in that particular machine. And so that was my first recollection of playing a video game. And I was completely hooked. And so I went off and I had my friends who had their Apple IIes sitting at home and started playing those wonderful classic, games on that were first available on the Apple way back in the day, long before we ever even heard the word Macintosh.
What was your first console or computer?
My first console or computer? Well, my first console. Well, actually, my first console was also my first computer. I had an Atari 400, and so it was it was a perfect kind of sales thing to give to my parents because you say, well, I need a computer so that whenever for my high school thing, this would be great because I could do all of my papers for school on this computer. Now, those of you who are too young to remember what the Atari 400 it was a gigantic box that you had, and it didn't have physical keys on it. It had a plastic membrane on it with keys kind of painted on the outside of it, and you pretty much had to pull out a chisel and a hammer in order to get it to take your key press commands. It was not the easiest computer to play with in the world. But the cool thing about it is it had a cartridge slot that was the same as like having an Atari 2600. You slap a cartridge in there. So one cartridge would be, here is Star Command, here is whatever. But it also had it had Word, basically something similar to Microsoft Word. And so it could do both things. It was a game machine and it was a computer. And so it was an easy way to kind of sell my parents on it. It had utility. I can do useful things with it. and I can teach myself how to program, but also I was able to do all these practical things. And so, also the great age in which your digital media was a cassette deck that you set up and you plugged in, and you set the tape started, and you walked away for 15 minutes or 30 minutes until the program downloaded, and then half the time it wouldn't have downloaded properly and start all over again. So,
Did you play a lot of Mule or
my
Necromancer, Jawbreaker?
my favorite game, and this really dates me, is my favorite game was Zork. I loved Zork, and of course, it was just a souped up version of the old adventure game that used to be played on the old supercomputers and everything. But that was my first love was Zork. Then pretty much almost all of the Infocom games. I adored all of the Infocom games. And of course, later on, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they did a great version, Planetfall, that they did. But of course, also to Star Control, not Star Control. I'm pulling all the names. Star Raiders. Star Raiders. And actually, Star Raiders was actually the point at which I actually started to exhibit game designer behavior. Because I would play Star Raiders, and that's when I actually started looking at it very critically and saying, okay, well, this is kind of cool, but after you've played it for a while ago, but I think I can make this better. And there was one critical moment whenever I was playing Star Raiders, is if you'd be flying through space and you have the floating starfield when it's going by, and you're chasing these things that look suspiciously like TIE fighters, but they weren't TIE fighters. We all know they weren't TIE fighters. Star Raiders. So you're chasing these things that look like TIE fighters, and so you see it flying through space, and you're trying to catch it and everything else. And then I got caught up with it, and at one point I had to go to the restroom or go do something else, and so I hit the space bar to pause it. And when I did so, I stopped moving through space. But then I'm watching the Star Raider, and then I realized it's doing nothing but making a circle 8 hanging there in space. And then it was just a matter of waiting until it crossed your crosshair. It's okay. It's now just a waiting game. Bang, you're dead. And then I pretty much learned the secret to beating the whole game. And so, well, I could do something better than that. And it was a magnificent game. I enjoyed it immensely. But that's the moment when I remember I started kind of dissecting games and saying, wow, I see how this works, and just kind of outthinking what they intended for it to happen. So.
Well, I'm not surprised, Neal, that you like those Infocom games so much, because I understand you have a really deep background with writing and reading.
Yeah, I before I even got into computer gaming and everything else, is that my first job out of high school was actually working as I was a disc jockey working at a radio station, and part of that, we had I was 17 years old, and I had access to a production at a radio station, which, just imagine any 17-year-old kid is like, oh my God, I've been handed this amazing toy. And so my buddy and I started making radio dramas. They were very kind of Twilight Zone, kind of weird kind of stuff that we were doing with it. And so we just kind of started doing this off to the side. And that was actually one of the things that whenever I submitted to eventually get my first game design job, was those scripts that I'd written for those radio, because the dialogue and basically showing off the fact that I was able to tell a story, and we're really only using sound effects and we're using voices without having to show anything else. And I said, well, now if we just add in the extra dimensions of what we were capable of doing with computers back in the day, then we'll just build on top of that. But I've always been kind of a weird designer from the standpoint is most of the newer designers that come into this, it seems like most of them come from the background. I am a programmer designer, I'm an artist writer, or what have you. I'm definitely of the ilk of writer designer. And I have almost every game that I have touched has had a very strong storytelling element to it. That's just part of who I am. And it's like there's a lot of titles that over the years I've been offered. I mean, at one point after I was at Dynamics, and they'd kind of closed the door on doing any more role playing games. For a while, they offered me a sports title. I think it was golf or something else like that. And I said, I really have no idea what I would do with golf. I said, unless you let me do something really twisted and perverted with it, I just don't, I feel the same way about like football and softball. I said, unless you let me do, okay, it's football, but both teams are zombies, or I always thought the coolest concept, and I still actually would like to do this, would be baseball, but all your players are superheroes. uh, um, and so so I got Flash. He's a good runner, not necessarily good out. So but anyway, but yeah, so writing and storytelling, it's an important part of who I am, and that's the hard part is finding, because I am a gamer. I'm one of those people say, if I'm making a game, the story still has to serve the gameplay, not the other way around. If people were primarily there to have to experience a story, and they want to read a book, they want to go see a movie, what have you. And so I'm very careful to try to make sure that the storytelling is in some way serving the gameplay. But again, that said, is I'm going to try to tell a great story if at all possible with whatever tools you hand me.
Well, I saw where in another interview where you talked a lot about Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu game, and I've interviewed Sandy Peterson on the show before, so I was wondering what was it about the that Call of Cthulhu game that you like so much?
Um, One of the things I liked about it is, number one is dragons, that there's this tendency is I climb the ladder and I get tougher and I get tougher and tougher, and by the end I'm a god, and from a progressive standpoint, that's very cool. Uh, but I didn't like the fact that it kind of allowed me to get lazier and lazier and lazier as a game player. And I prefer whenever the players are using their heads as much as using, their wand of whip missiles or what have you. I like them to be able to think their way through a problem. Also, too, I was a huge, back in the day, I was a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft. Early on, I was very much into Poe, and then I discovered H.P. Lovecraft, and then just everything I could get my hands on by H.P. I just read to pieces. Uh, Largely because he was one of the first people that I had read that had read a horror story where I felt like he really honestly let us feel what it would be like to really be exposed to these terrible, horrible things that are out there. Because he's got this weird journalistic tale, and he's telling it through journals, and he's telling it through, here are newspaper records and all this other stuff. And so it made it seem much more real by the way he kind of masked what was going on. Um, so yeah, huge Lovecraft fan. But again, I love the. I also was just a big fan of the skill system that they had in the Chaosium stuff, because I've never really liked the, okay, so I'm going to pick. I am a necromancer dark elf, and you say, okay, and I can only ever do these skills because I am a necromancer dark elf, and I just never liked being stuck in that cage, and I want to be able to say that I'm going to move forward, and I'm going to explore this skill, and I'm going to explore this skill. Of course, the beautiful thing about Lovecraft's universe is there are prices to be paid for. He says, yes, you're going to advance in this particular skill, but you're also going to go slowly mad, and that's just appeals to my perverted sense of humor. So that I enjoyed that a great deal. But anyway, I had great respect for their system, and honestly, it was a huge influence on Krondor, and actually for several of the titles I've worked on. Is anything I like a broader, more open system, and granted, you have any numbers of problems of, okay, now I've got a tank mage running around. What am I going to do about that particular situation? So you still have to have it set up so that the universe kind of pushes back. And also, too, just from the standpoint of opening up a box as a gamer, and say that I'm not necessarily a hardcore role-playing game. Of course, you can make the argument, well, if you're not a hardcore RPG player, you're never going to open up this title in your life anyway, so why do you care? But I don't like saying immediately there's a bar that I'm going to put in front of you and none shall pass. And so I like the idea that I can open up the box and I don't have to know what all these classes mean. I don't need to know what these restrictions are before I start the game. Just start playing. And then as you play into the game and into the experience, you start finding ways that I can progress in this way. I can progress in this way based on the things I have done. But it's not like I had to sit down and read, okay, here's open up the guidebook on page 47. Here are the spells that I'm allowed to do. And it's just like, I have to do all of this other stuff before I can even play. And that seems to me completely antithetical towards actually playing a game. I should be able to open it up, start playing, and let my choices guide how I develop, not with some sort of arbitrary thing that I decide at the beginning when I have no information.
It's funny you should mention manuals, because it's my understanding that's how you got your start in the games industry, right? At least in 1990, I was reading about you're doing some work for New World Computing. Of course, that's a company a lot of RPG fans should recognize. So I'm just wondering, how did you end up in this company?
So New World Computing, whenever I first was brought on with New World, is a good friend of mine, Ken Mayfield, is actually the guy who got me in there. And Ken was an artist. I had always been great, whenever I was in junior high, I thought, oh, well, I'm going to be an artist. I was really, really interested in being an art. And then one time I went into art class and there were these illustrations on the wall that were kind of pinned up. And I'm looking at these incredible starships and all the battle plating and all the greeblies that are all over it. And I'm looking at the stuff going, oh, holy crap. I'm just like, yeah, I'm never going to be that good. And I'm going, this was just in junior high. And so, but I got to know him, and Ken and I became really good friends. And so over the years, he gave me some kind of tutoring in some art stuff. And then later on, he got a job working for Task Force Games, which of course at the time owned the Starfleet Battles license. And so Task Force Games, in turn, there was a time period in which New World Computing owned Task Force Games. And so they were interested in making a Starfleet Battles related game. So they had asked Ken to come in and design the starships and do all this other kind of cool stuff. And so about 5 months or 6 months after Ken got to New World, he called me up and said, "Hey, Neal, we got this opening for an artist on my team, and would you love to come and do it?" And I said, "Man, I'd love to come and do it, but it's just, to be honest, it's like the amount of time that it would take me to do one of your illustrations, you'd have to fire me. It's just too ridiculously long for me to do what you do." And I said, "Appreciate the offer, but thanks, but I don't want to embarrass you or me." So he said, "Okay, I can stand that. I can respect that." So then about 3 more months come back. He says, "There's an opening going to be coming up at New World, and it's going to be for writing science fiction and fantasy stories for what we do. Would you be interested in that?" Now, Ken knew I was a writer. And I said, "Okay, let's see. Stay where I am," because this is just a few months after I graduated from college. I said, "Stay where I am, working in a direct mail place that I hate with a passion, or move to California and make computer games, writing science fiction and fantasy storylines, and be paid every month to do that." Yeah, that decision wasn't very hard. And so I get out out there and meet with John Van Caneghem, who of course was the head of New World, and of course the father of the Might and Magic series, and had a great little interview with him. And it was funny because I went out there and we did the interview, and so I said, "So well, so I imagine you'll be making a choice on this in about 2 or 3 weeks or whatever when I'll hear back." He said, "Oh no, you're hired." And I'm like, "Okay, all right. Well, when am I going to start? Well, when can you get here?" And so I went back home and packed up all of my stuff into a 73 Mustang and came barreling out to Van Nuys, California, which is where I was living. New World at the time was in Woodland Hills, which wasn't too terribly far away. But anyway, long digression. But they were working on a game called Tunnels and Trolls, which was originally was a pen and paper game from Flying Buffalo, and they had a deal with a company called StarCraft to first do a version of the Tunnels and Trolls as an electronic game in Japan. Then they were going to port it back to the United States as a PC title. So whenever I got there, they've handed me this big, thick document. It was about that deep. He said, okay, here's all the text from the game, from the Japanese version of the game that they have translated into English. And so all we need you to do is to take what they've given back to us and rewrite it so that it flows a little bit better and it makes some sort of sense, because a lot of it was sort of in pidgin English. And it was just kind of weird because you'd be going along and there'd be something that would be perfectly fine and rational. And then you get to a line and sudden boat turn turtle. What? And the problem was, this is in the era before we have design documents. There's no such thing as a design document back in these days. And so what I had was a stack of text, no indication at what point it takes place in the game, or what the circumstances are whenever it takes place. And so I said, I need some kind of context for this, so that I can completely understand what's going on, because this is incomprehensible for me to read. They said, oh, okay, well, we have a copy of the game. Okay, great, fantastic. We've got it set up for you over here. And of course, they turn me to this computer, and it's a Japanese computer, and the game is in Japanese. And so the best thing I can do is kind of play the game in Japanese. Of course, I don't speak or read a single word of Japanese, but I can try to step through the experience and figure out what's going on based on what's in the text versus what's going on the screen. So I rewrote Tunnels and Trolls from beginning to end based on only a stack of this really bad English text and playing the game in Japanese. I will have to say, hands down, that was the hardest assignment I have ever had. And so that's how I got started, was rewriting Tunnels and Trolls. And of course, the frustrating thing is that I think I'd heard of the name Tunnels and Trolls before, but I hadn't been really aware of it being a pen and paper game. I knew Dungeons and Dragons, I knew RuneScape and RuneQuest and all these other classic games, but I wasn't aware of Tunnels and Trolls. So one day I'm in John Van Cannigan's office and we're just having a casual conversation, and he needs to go. He leaves for a few minutes to do something. I turn around and I'm looking at John's bookcase. He has all this magnificent stuff, and I look down and it says Tunnels and Trolls. I said, oh, wow, okay, this is cool. I'm going to pull this out and see what this is. And I open it up, and lo and behold, here's the English text that had been turned into Japanese, which I then turned back into English. Perfectly. I said, why didn't you guys ever tell me this text existed? Were you just doing this sort of bizarre, strange, test to see if I was going to come up to snuff or whatever? So I unnecessarily rewrote Tunnels and Trolls. But anyway, it worked out just fine. But that was that was how I got started. And from there, JVC said that, well, the next big project, we have two things going on. We have Might and Magic 3 that we want to do. And so, of course, John Van Cannigan, of course, that was his baby. His design, he's in charge of doing everything else. But he wanted to have someone to write the story and help kind of develop some of the characters and everything for that. And at the same time, they had Planet's Edge, which was the idea was Starfleet Battles kind of game that they wanted to kind of turn into basically what the idea is take Star Control, imagine the old school Star Control, and it'd be very similar to that, but you would have shield facings, and you would add to the idea is you would fly to a planet, and then it would suddenly become sort of a top-down, almost Ultima-style role-playing game. Plus, you could build your own ships. I mean, it was crazy. We were like crossing all of these genres for Planet's Edge. And so we went along for about 2 or 3 months, and we were working on both of them, but JVC was really busy with Might and Magic 3. And I was saying, I really can't. I said, I'm just kind of getting started here. I've never designed a game ever. and I don't think that I'm really up to designing two of them from scratch simultaneously. I've done plenty of Dungeons and Dragons campaigns and Call of Cthulhu and all this other stuff, but and these electronic games, it's a totally new ball game for me. And so I said, here is my basic idea for what I think should happen with Might and Magic 3, and handed him kind of my document on that. And I said, I think I'd actually like to take a crack at Planet's Edge, simply because there really was no father really for Planet's Edge. He was sort of in charge of that particular title. Oh, that's my wife coming in back there. But co-author of Swords and Circuitry. But JVC's coming in, and so I was just telling JVC is that I really think that Planet's Edge needs more attention than obviously Might and Magic 3. And I said, I've got another friend of mine who I went to high school with, who's a writer. And I said, I think you ought to hire him to do the story for Might and Magic. And let me concentrate on doing Planet's Edge and doing the story there, because it was just such a huge story, and so completely unlike what they had done with Might and Magic. They had said originally the mission statement was Might and Magic 3 in space, which was a little strange because Might and Magic already kind of was in space if you knew what the backstory of Might and Magic was. But anyway, so what it ultimately kind of morphed into is, I said, it's Star Trek. I fly around, I'm in space, I have my cool spaceship, I beam down to the planets. I have every time you beam down to a planet, it was like a self-contained episode of Star Trek. There was a whole plot line that happened. And so anyway, so Planet's Edge ended up being my first start to finish design game. And I learned a ton of stuff on the title. A lot of stuff I did right and a lot of stuff I did really wrong. But we were still a bestseller for the time period. We won several awards, and which, to be fresh out of the gate, I was just floored and honored to have had a chance to do that. And it was while I was at New World, I met John Cutter, who worked for a while there, and he actually was a manager both on Planet's Edge and on Might and Magic 3. And so he then moved on to Dynamics, and he's the one that ultimately called me up and said, "Hey, you want to come make a game based on Ray Feist's books?" And so that was another opportunity. I kind of hopped for that. So that was sort of my New World story, and that's how I got started doing this. So I went from translating incomprehensible Japanese stuff to making a game from scratch.
A couple little questions about this era. One, you said you thought you did some things right and some things wrong with Planet's Edge. I kind of wondering what you would have done differently. Also wondering, did you call him JVC to his face? I mean, was that his code name?
I mean, everybody who ever worked with John, over the time, everybody would just call him JVC. Of course, it was so funny too, because the New World Computing was a really unique game company, and I have to say, in a lot of respects, it spoiled me in a lot of ways, because this is that end of what I consider the first. If we look at sort of the ages of computer developments, almost like they are geological ages, and New World was sort of the end of that first generation of all the classic games. So with the first Wizardry, the Might and Magic, all of these things. And that company, we didn't have a publisher. We were the publisher. We didn't have people coming in, and we didn't have to stop and do dog and pony shows. We made the game we wanted to make. And so there was, John was the oldest guy in the company at 30 years old. All the rest of us were, early to mid 20s. I think our programmer was 22. Eric was I think Eric was like about 22 years old for Planet's Edge. I mean, we were all kids. And the thing of it is the company never ever truly shut down, because almost any given hour you would go there would be someone there. Not because we were being worked to death. I mean, it wasn't like somebody, you be here and we have this deadline. Slipping deadlines at New World was like, it's done when it's done. We basically said, and whenever we were happy with it, we pushed it out the door. So anyway, but I was just trying to say is that it was a very informal environment there. I mean, there was nobody was up on a pedestal. And when I first went in, he's like, "Oh my god, magic and everything else," and then John was like anybody else. He's just he was the most mellow person you will ever meet. I mean, it literally, if you were to walk in the door and say, "John, I took a chainsaw and I killed your entire family, and your home is in flames. I wrecked your Porsche," and he'd say, "I'm really upset about that." He just terminally mellow guy. And again, I love JVC to death, and anybody who ever worked for John would tell you the same thing. And he was absolutely the right boss to kind of start in this industry because he was very tolerant of making mistakes and everything else. It's okay, do better. Let's try this. Let's do this. And but very different. Very different. I mean, there's no game companies out there that remind me of that. Other than, I will say, and this is where I put in my plug about Wildman, is Gas Powered Games. Gas Powered Games reminds me of what it felt like to work at New World in those days of saying, you know what, we're making the best possible game. I don't care what the publisher says. I don't care what we have some bean counter says we have to release on Tuesday. Gas Powered is like, say, hey man, we're making a fantastic game. It is done when it's done. And so anyway, so as to the other point, what do we do right and what do we do wrong? The biggest thing with Plant's Edge that I think that we didn't do right is that I don't think that we had spent enough time. It was a very complex title because we had a space combat game and a ground role-playing game, and then we also had, sort of sandwiching these two things together, there was a resource gathering game that was sandwiched in the middle of it because you're building your starship and you're upgrading it, but you're also having to fly around different planets. You would stop and you would harvest, and there were definitely times whenever you had too much or too little of stuff. The resources weren't quite as balanced as they should be. And some of the sectors that you're flying through, they were just insanely difficult. And we allowed you to fly into areas. It's in some ways it's kind of funny because it was almost like an open world because we allowed you to go to areas where you really shouldn't be, and we let you know it basically by killing you. And so there's just some disjointedness about it. It was very kind of uneven, which again is exactly what you'd expect from somebody who had just made their first ever game, and and also too is because of the way that it was structured. This is before design documents. There were at least I wasn't aware of design documents in this period of my career. I'll put it that way. And nobody else there was. I was actually the overeducated one at the company. There was no one else there that had a college degree. I was Dr. Neal, because everybody else says, "I want to do this. Go do whatever." A lot of people had college classes and done other things, but I was the only one that actually been to school. But with the design document, we didn't really have anything that explained this is exactly how this is going to work, and it was more you do it and we test it, and does that work? No, it doesn't. And as a result, like I said, there's that kind of disjointedness that I was talking about. Is this system over here doesn't necessarily play nicely with this one, and we don't necessarily realize they don't play nicely until you're several levels into the game. And so we didn't have a little chart, and we didn't have all our little, PowerPoint, not PowerPoint, but we didn't have our little Excel sheets that are all filled out that figure out, okay, if we do this and here's this curve and blah, blah, blah. So no design documents. So there was myself, an artist, Ken, and Eric Hyman, who was the programmer. And at any given time, we didn't always know exactly what the other one was doing on the game. I would go into Eric's office and I would say, here are 5 levels that I've mapped out, and so here's what's supposed to happen. It was very like a Dungeons and Dragons map that you'd hand to somebody and say, you get to tile 5, you step on it, this thing happens. And so Eric would then later, get it, look at it 3 weeks later and say, okay, thing happens. I have to figure out how thing X works, And so it wasn't like I sat down and gave here's a feature set, and we need to be able to do all the following. I would hand him a story outline, and he would be stuck with, well, how the hell do I make that work? And so he would put in something that would be sort of like what I had in mind, and I would not realize until later that whatever he put in wasn't exactly what I had in mind, and X thing later that I had planned hooked into how that resolved. And so you have all these little cracks and little tiny holes that stuff didn't line up. And again, design documentation, your team kind of needs to be able to communicate in a unified, understandable way. And so that was kind of a mess for us. So.
And that's all for this week's episode. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I should be back next week with part 2 of my interview with Mr. Neal Hallford. A lot of great stuff in that episode, so stay tuned. I know you guys will enjoy it. As always, I want to thank you very much if you have supported the show. All you have to do is go to armchairarcade.com, look for the Matt Chat link in the top right corner. You can set up a subscription of $1 per week if you so choose, or more, or you can make a one-time donation. Anything is much appreciated, guys, so thank you very much to any and all those who have supported the show. Now, what about that? Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention. Neal has started a Kickstarter project. Actually, it's been going on for a while, but it still has 2 weeks left. And what it is a novel. This is Thief of Dreams Kickstarter project. He's trying to raise $24,000, raised $7,000 at the time of this interview. Now, he is, of course, the author of Betrayal at Krondor, the game, and Dungeon Siege. I know he's got a really amazing talent, and I love his work. So, of course, I wanted to back this pledge and encourage you, or pledge to this Kickstarter, and encourage you to do the same. So, go check it out, and if you like what you see, make a pledge and keep Neal doing what he does best, creating wonderful fantasy. Now, what about that ale of the week? This week I've got an India Pale Ale, and that's apparently what this is called as well. This is out of Odell Brewing Company at Fort Collins, Colorado. Got a nice little bottle here, kind of a guy riding an elephant there, and on the back a little story about what an IPA is and where it comes from. You probably heard that story a few times if you are a fan of ale. It's got a 7% alcohol, and not a lot here about the, anything that might make it special. But anyway, let's get it open and see what it's all about. All right, so I got this IPA here from Odell and the rather excellent drinking horn. It smells good. You can really smell the hops in these. Usually IPAs are very hoppy, almost bitter sometimes, but this one smells quite nice. A little bit of a citrusy, lemony type of scent there too. Anyway, let's give it a taste. Rather creamy there. I'm going to call some of my mustache there. Creamy, chocolatey, sort of coffee-like flavors. You can definitely tell the hops. Kind of a nutty-like sweetness to this too. I gotta say, all around this is quite pleasant, almost like a chocolatey drink with some beer in it. Really nice. I like it's just the right amount of hoppiness there. You can really taste it without it being overpowering or bitter. I really have to say I'm really impressed with this IPA from Odell. I'm going to go a full 5 out of 5 drinking horns on this one. Just a really solid IPA, and it's actually quite easy to find these around here. So actually, maybe I should try some of their other ales. This is quite promising. Anyway, let's wrap up with a quotation. And the quotation for this week comes from Robert Benchley, and it goes something like this: "A freelance writer is a man who is paid per piece, per word, or perhaps." See you guys next week.
Oh, are we friends now?
Of course we are. Just because I pay you for your services doesn't diminish our friendship.
Enhances it, really.